Hi, welcome back to another episode of swapnangal. Let us dream together. In this video, we're going to learn about the eastern frontier of the Cape. When the British took over the Cape, they brought with them soldiers and officials to govern the colony. The most important official was the governor, because it was the governor's job to report to the government in Britain. The chief military officer was in charge of the army and the soldiers. At different times, the army at the Cape Colony was made up of different groups of soldiers called regiments. There were regiments of soldiers from Britain, of Britain colonists, Khoikhoi soldiers, and farmer settlers who were part-time soldiers. There was tension between the British government and some of the trekboer farmers on the eastern frontier of the Cape Colony. Now that the British government was in charge, some new changes occurred. The circuit courts were introduced by the British government. The Khoikhoi servants could make complaints of ill treatment by their white employers to the circuit court. Some of the trekboers referred to this as the Black Circuit because they thought that the British government was biased against them. A trekboer farmer called colonist lived in the Eastern Cape Colony. In 1815, his Khoikhoi servant complained to the circuit court that he had not paid him. Colonist refused to appear before the court. 2 British officers and 12 Khoikhoi soldiers were sent to arrest him. Colonist fired on the soldiers, and the soldiers fired back, and Beizadenhout was killed. After Beizadenhout's funeral, his brother organized a rebellion against the British authority at Slagtersnek. There were only 60 rebels who surrendered without a shot being fired. After being sentenced, 4 of the leaders were hanged. The British had to control the vast eastern frontier of the Cape Colony because it had been weakly administered for a long period of time. To do this, the government introduced new laws to control the freedom of movement of the Khoikhoi still living in the Cape Colony. They recruited young Khoikhoi men into military service. They thought that by enlisting the Khoikhoi in a regiment, they would be able to control the Khoikhoi as well as strengthen their army over the trekboers. Some Khoikhoi did join the army, but others were reluctant to enlist. David Sternman was a Khoikhoi leader living in the eastern frontier. He led a group of Khoikhoi on the frontier that was in the Cape Colonial Territory. He gave shelter to runaway slaves as well as Khoikhoi who had refused to register and who had refused to do military services. In 1823, the British government exiled David Sternman to Australia, hoping that it would stop the Khoikhoi resistance. In 1820, the government of Britain paid for a large group of people of about 4,000 unemployed British to come to the Cape as settlers. The settlers arrived in Algoa Bay. Each family was given a small piece of land to grow crops. More than half the settlers who came to the Cape were from cities and towns and didn't know how to farm. They didn't even know about southern Africa. They were given land in the Zeerveld. By 1882, most of the new settlers had left their farm and worked in different jobs in new small settler towns in the eastern frontier. Some of them have been traders and have set up shops and businesses. They also traded shop-bought goods for things like ivory and animal skins with the Xhosa across the border. The remaining farmers planted maize, rye and barley and started farming with merino sheep introduced from Britain. The climate and grazing were perfect for sheep farming. There was a great demand in Britain for wool for textile factories. Sheep farming became very profitable, and by 1846, wool had become the Cape's most successful export. During the late 18th century, the British started to question the practice of slavery and their own involvement in the trade of slaves. In 1807, the British stopped slave trade in all its colonies. But it did not mean that slavery ended. The ending of the slave trade did not help the people who were already slaves. No new slaves could be bought and sold within the colony itself. A lot of people in Britain thought that slavery was wrong and that all human beings should be free. They believed that slavery was cruel and against the will of God. They put pressure on the British government to end slavery. People began to say that Britain would become richer if the workers were paid wages. These are some of the reasons why they thought so. Workers would be motivated to work harder if they were paid and if they were free. Workers would use those wages to buy products, and this will help the economy to grow. By the 19th centuries, these livestock farmers, also called boers or trekboers, started to move further and further away from Cape Town. They used the land as they wished and led self-sufficient lives. The Dutch authorities were unable to control the trekboers. However, when the British arrived in the 1800s with their English language and culture, this changed. The British began to control the Boers' use of land. The farms had to be bought if they wanted to use the land. It was the end of free land for the Boer colonists of the Cape. The Boers had freedom to treat their Khoikhoi servants and slaves as they wished, but this changed because in 1828 the British passed down the law known as Ordinance 50, which allowed the Khoikhoi to move freely in the Cape Colony, and in 1838 all colonist slaves had to be freed. After the Sixth Frontier War, which was between 1834 to 1836, and Chief Macoma's attack on the colony, colonists began to leave the eastern frontier. In 1836, the British governor returned the land between the Keiskamma River and the Keis River to the Xhosa and made peace with the Xhosa chiefs. The Boer colonists had hoped to get land across the Keiskamma. Many Boers decided to leave the eastern frontier. They took their families, servants and slaves and trekked northwards away from the Cape Colony and from British control. Between 1835 and 1841, about 7,000 Boer men, women and children crossed the Gariep or Orange River and left the Cape Colony. This was about half the Boer population of the Eastern Cape. Years later, this immigration was called the Great Trek. The Boers who were part of the trek were called voortrekkers. Thank you for watching my video. If you found this video informative, then please like, share and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Till then, signing off, Shoni. Bye-bye.